We assume in law that champagne will always taste like champagne and that a region's identity is in some way fixed. But climate change, trade pressures, cultural and economic goals of a region are destabilizing some of those assumptions. I think that IP has a problem with public perception and mistrust. I feel it's ironic that IP has an IP problem. What we can do a better job of is helping people to understand the true importance of strong IP for innovation, for invention, and to promote, incentivize, protect human creativity.
Welcome to the new episode of Talk IP to Me, the podcast where we break intellectual property down so it actually makes sense. I'm your host, David, and today we are diving into one of the most underused and, in my opinion, least understood tools in IP, geographical indications. Today I'm joined by Megan Carpenter, an internationally recognized IP scholar, the former dean of UNH Franklin Pierce School of Law, and someone who just recently climbed Kilimanjaro. And as I understand, Megan, you are currently traveling the globe visiting sake breweries, wine regions, and different places on the planet, and probably living some of our dreams in this industry. But as I understand, you're doing research for your next book. Megan, welcome to Talk IP to Me.
Thank you so much for having me, David. I'm really excited for our conversation today.
Me too. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation. And to be honest, before we invited you, I spotted your LinkedIn post about climbing Kilimanjaro. And then around the same time, you also announced stepping down as the dean of one of the most renowned law schools in the US. And I was just wondering what happened there. You had such an incredible result with the law school. You spent 8 years, as I understand, there. What happened?
Oh, I've always thought of myself as a builder, and I'm always drawn to situations where I think there's some kind of challenge and an opportunity to create something meaningful. And when I joined the University of New Hampshire, Franklin Pierce, and stepped into the deanship, the law school was struggling financially, enrollment, alumni engagement. And over the course of my time there, we were able to turn the institution around and break records in each of those areas. And it was incredibly rewarding work, especially because of the team that I was able to work with and all of the incredible alumni, especially in the IP space around the globe. And I loved every minute of it. But um, there's a time, I think, in a place, and higher education is at an inflection point where incremental change isn't really enough, and you can pull inward or you and preserve kind of what exists, or you can expand outward and rethink what's possible. And that was really my philosophy at Franklin Pierce. And it has been Franklin Pierce's philosophy since it was founded in the early 70s. But for me, this time really raised the question of having achieved all we were able to achieve as a team, where can I have the most impact next? And particularly for me, at a more global level, thinking about innovation, legal systems, how we can support creativity and innovation, invention, creativity in a world that is just so rapidly changing. And so I am really enthusiastic about that. And I guess Kilimanjaro is part of that transition in some way. I climbed the mountain
Mhm.
through a leadership program I'd been a part of for about 6 months. It was an executive leadership group that we were working together for quite some time, and then this was the graduation. The company I worked with was called Mountains and Marathons, and so I worked with other leaders, and um, throughout our process, this was kind of our experience where we got together in person for the first time and took on this challenge. And so I guess there's a connection in some ways substantively to the work that I'm doing now. When you're climbing, you're very aware of how conditions shape outcomes. The altitude, the weather, the timing, the teamwork, everything matters in both leadership and in climbing a mountain. And I think that's true of the legal systems that I'm studying now as well. But more simply, I love a good mountain in every sense of the word. And I think that was something that we successfully summited at Franklin Pierce, and something that certainly was true of Kilimanjaro as well.
Wow, I mean, that's remarkable. Not only what you've done with the university, but also, climbing Kilimanjaro. It's both physically and mentally an achievement that not many humans are able to do. So, really, hats off to you. As I understand, you describe yourself as a creator, someone who likes to create value, both economic and social value. And you describe yourself as a creative ninja on your LinkedIn as well. And you've had decades of experience and you've reached quite big mountains, not only in the terms of Kilimanjaro, but also in professional work. So, what I'm curious about is what excites your mind right now. How
Mm.
did the book idea came about?
At its core, I think the book examines how places transform identity into value. And my upbringing, I grew up in West Virginia on a small country road where my grandparents lived on the same road. My uncle and aunt lived on the same road. We would canoe. We lived on the river and canoed to each other's houses in the summer. And I was very much shaped who I am as a person, my sense of hard work and ethics, social value. Um, I find meaning is so imbued in my upbringing and a sense of place in how I was raised and where I was raised. My dad lived in Washington, D.C. much of my childhood. And so I balanced my time between both places. And while I was imbued with this sense of place as an individual, I also had a real passion for sort of policy and law and democratic institutions and
Mm,
so I felt like I was very connected, that the place where I grew up and the way I grew up became a real part of my identity. Since over the last 20 years or so, 30 years maybe now, I've examined how different emerging economies, people create economic value and community development by connecting kind of a sense of place, leveraging strengths in identity in new ways. And that really is the foundation for intellectual property, the legal framework around human creativity and innovation and invention. And there's an intersection of law and market and culture. And so my book examines how places themselves transform some kind of identity into value using those
mm,
mechanisms, law, markets, culture. And then what happens when the conditions that define that place start to shift, including through mechanisms like climate change. And with IP, we've built global markets on assumptions that places themselves are stable. Much like the places that many of us grew up have changed over time. Um, the same has happened with place that laws around value that connect to identity. So we assume in law that champagne will always taste like champagne and that a region's identity is in some way fixed. Um,
mm.
but climate change, trade pressures, cultural and economic goals of a region, and technology as it is emerging and evolving so rapidly are destabilizing some of those assumptions. So the book looks at how IP systems like geographical indications, trademarks, trade frameworks respond when the thing that they're built to protect, authenticity tied to place, becomes more fluid. And as I'm
Wow.
digging in, it's really a story about how law and culture and markets adapt when the ground is really kind of shifting underneath them.
I really love your framing, especially because now I personally really feel like the world is changing so fast, not only in terms of climate change, but also, macroeconomically looking at the world and the people and cultures due to globalization or some sort of, political instability. Things are shifting really fast from one day to another. And yeah, authenticity tied to certain places, can it change or will it change? I think that's a very, very relevant topic to research right now. But before we dive deep into it, could you please clarify what is geographical indication for the listeners?
Sure. And it's probably worth distinguishing geographical indications from trademarks because there's a lot
Mhm.
of overlap between the two. And in fact, in the United States, they subject matter that would typically be treated under GIs are treated under trademarks. Um,
Hmm.
so both trademarks and GIs are effectively both economic development and consumer protection tools. Um, a trademark is a word, name, symbol, anything really that's used in commerce to signify an individual source of goods and services. You think about in the United States the golden arches of McDonald's, or what it would be like to go into a store with no trademarks and it would take forever to pick out your products. It makes consumer purchasing decisions much more efficient. You can see a symbol and you know this brand is reliable. This is my favorite brand of cereal, and put that in your cart or your basket to check out more expediently. It also incentivizes producers to invest in quality so that consumers will see those trademarks and they'll symbolize something good, rather than something to avoid. Um, and so there's incredible value in a trademark for a company. A GI, a geographical indication, is related but different. It's a collective right. It's an identification of source in a different way, where a product, the identity is tied to where it comes from. And that place itself contributes something that's essential to its quality or reputation. That can be a set of practices and processes. It can involve certain environmental, climate, weather conditions. It can involve shared expectations and culture. And interesting to me, it can be very helpful for developing economies, as a tool for economic development in a region that's looking to leverage some kind of existing strengths or identities to build markets in new ways.
Hmm. That's really interesting. And I think the distinction that you made, it's also really important to double down on. So just to summarize, the trademark belongs to a company, usually a for-profit company, but it can be also non-profit. And then a GI belongs to a place or a community. Would that be a fair conclusion?
Yes, exactly. And GIs are really, as a collective, right? They're generally public versus a private right, and
Yeah.
something that is for an entire region and more inclusive in that way. Yeah.
Yeah. And while trademarks are based on what I know you apply for, as a person or company or legal entity to certain trademark or patent offices. Who decides what is a GI? How does a GI get created, basically?
You hit on something that is a critical difference between the two in the kind of individual right versus a collective right. And that was something that struck me in Japan in particular. Um, the national government in Japan has set up a system of GIs that's based on effectively prefectures. There are 47 prefectures in Japan, and so if an individual, the sake producers in a particular region, um, if they are interested in obtaining a GI, then there's a kind of collective agreement that needs, the group needs to kind of come together around a certain identity and what the criteria will be, and then have that approved through the national government.
Hmm. And if I understood it correctly, in this case, this is a top down process from the Japanese government's initiative. Is there some case when it can also be a bottom up process where certain producers start doing something and then it gets recognized by the government much later on, or maybe a trade organization?
Yes, absolutely. I would say it's both. I mean, it is top down in some ways, but then it has to be bottom up too, because
Hmm.
there's no way to kind of make the GI work unless there is a collective group getting together to decide
Yeah.
what that criteria should be. And in some, I mean, in Japan, in some prefectures, there has been great collaboration and healthy competition in a way that helps truly define and distinguish the GI. Um, and in others, it may be more difficult. But there is this necessary collaboration between both kind of bottom up and top down in order to make it work in a successful way.
Hmm. Makes total sense. And just to follow up on the Japanese trip that you had, or the experience and research that you've gathered there, as I understand, you visited some sake breweries in Yamagata. Um, so, could you give us a practical example of how maybe a small family owned business in that region can benefit from the GI protection that the region has?
Sure. What struck me in Yamagata was it was the first prefecture, the first region to um, have a GI in Japan. And, in Yamagata, the GI is doing kind of two things at once. It's protecting place, but it's also protecting a certain discipline. Now, sake is different than wine in many ways, but one of them is that the process itself is much more industrial than agricultural. So wine is a fairly simplistic process, and it's very much connected to the land. When it comes to sake brewing, there are many different steps, and a lot of components of the production. There are a lot of variables that come into it, from the koji, the yeast production, to different phases of working with the rice and the water, um, and the brewing methods. So it's not just geography in per se. It's geography that's also expressed through craft and process. And
Mhm.
so that is an interesting component when it comes to sake brewing, because that means that each of the producers that each one that is making sake might have its own, and different regions might have their own individual processes as well. So it can be more challenging, I think, to come up with a regional identity, a GI for a particular prefecture. What was fascinating for me, one sake brewery that I visited was a 24th generation brewery. And
Wow.
the um, there when I was talking with the owner, the GI almost felt secondary because their identity is already deeply rooted in family history, in technique, in the reputation they've had all of this time. And so the GI itself becomes less about creating value and more about signaling that value, preserving it and signaling it, especially for global markets.
Hmm.
How, I don't know if you, this was really surprising to me. When you think about the global market for sake and the domestic market, only maybe 4 to 6% of the market for sake in Japan is domestic. The
Wow.
vast majority of sake is sold for export. And there is a long history for hundreds of years of the government engaged in the sake industry, of sort of regulating it in a variety of ways to encourage or to restrict during certain times. Um, so the real function, I think, of the GI system in Japan when it comes to sake is telling a story and creating that taxonomy and value for the export market to develop trust. I mean, to tell a consumer, especially one that is far from Japan, that this product is tied to a place in some kind of meaningful, verifiable,
Hmm.
authentic way. And I think that perhaps similar to and distinguishable from other places in the world, um, helps primarily to tell that story externally and to build the export market in that way.
I think that's just such an important signal, especially the stat that you mentioned about domestic market versus export,
Yeah. And
and
when
the
you
fact
think,
that GI,
I'm sorry,
yeah, no, 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 go ahead.
when, when you think about wine, we might say, around the world, there might be already a taxonomy around this is Bordeaux, this is Champagne, this is a Napa Cabernet. But with sake, I'm not sure that the global market yet has that kind of taxonomy around quality. And so some of the GI function, the goals, I believe, of the GI system um, in Japan is to create that kind of taxonomy of quality, to be able to say, this is a Yamagata, this is a Niigata, and that has a certain flavor profile separate from the sakes that might come from farther west or south, the Hyogo region or something. And I don't know that globally there is yet that kind of vernacular or taxonomy. And so the GI is in a way a vehicle to create value on a global scale and take care of that storytelling in a shorthand way.
That's just so interesting because it also highlights, cultural values or history, or just when you mention a 24th generational sake brewery, that's just fascinating. That's embedded in the whole family. That's their life
Mhm.
essentially. And I assume GIs also acknowledge the fact that there are certain territories where this is happening more often than not,
Yeah,
and then distinguishes it from the rest of the producers in the country.
yeah.
So Yamagata is a good example of the Japanese sake, but we can also talk about France. You brought up Champagne and Bordeaux, and of course all the other wines. And one thing you mentioned that, of course, the climate is changing. So some of these fields or wine fields are actually changing. So can Champagne be still Champagne if that particular geographical region, or at least the weather, the climate changes perhaps 20, 30, 50 years from now?
Yes, it's such an interesting question that you ask because, and it's not a hypothetical one. It's really a very practical one where, if temperatures continue to rise, if to the extent that the climate and the weather become more unpredictable, it's possible that champagne will struggle to maintain the kind of acidity and balance that are hallmarks of its style. And at the same time, places like Southern England, for example, are becoming increasingly suitable and beneficial for developing sparkling wine. But legally, when you think about the GI, champagne will still mean champagne. The GI is tied to geography, not quality, but we could end up in a situation where the the name champagne remains protected and valuable, but the classic expression of that style is shifting over time. And that creates a real tension, I think, between legal authenticity and perceived quality. Bordeaux, for example, um, another example that we could talk about in some detail, um, is a region where, if you think about a classic Bordeaux blend, you would name five different grapes pretty specifically. But in 2021, the governing authority increased the number of grapes by they added six different grapes that could be part of the Bordeaux appellation, including some grapes that are not historically French. So Touriga Nacional, for example, which is a Portuguese grape, was added to the list, and those adaptations, it is no unique position for law to be in that it is kind of evolving and catching up to cultural shifts and technological shifts. Um, and so this is something that we must do in a changing society, but um, the GI is effectively evolving to accommodate um, shifts in climate and weather in ways that are very practically impactful.
And I assume it's not only wine that is impacted by this, but also many, many other industries and GIs, right?
Absolutely. So we would see in coffee shifts to higher altitudes, olive oil, new regions emerging as some of traditional ones might struggle. Um, i in the sake industry, it is very heavily dependent upon rice, and the classic rice that is used for sake, Yamada Nishiki, is has been grown in southern regions in Japan, but now it's able to be grown in more northern areas
Mm.
where it hadn't been able to be grown before. Fisheries, I mean, there are so many different industries. I think of wine in a way as a canary in a coal mine, though, be because it's like one of the first industries, I think, where you can really taste the impact. Grapes are they're incredibly sensitive to small shifts in temperature, in water, in timing. So when the climate changes and or becomes even unpredictable, wine changes itself, sometimes subtly and sometimes dramatically. And it's particularly interesting to look at from the lens of IP and geographical indications because it's one of the most legally structured industries around place. So when the climate shifts, it's not just the product that's affected, it's the identity, the label, the legal framework. So that's why I think of it as a canary in a coal mine, because it shows us early on and very visibly what happens when the relationship between place and product and the legal frameworks that promote that in an economic development sense, um, when that starts to break down.
Hmm. And one thing I'm very interested in hearing more about is when you are actually there, yeah, let's say in Yamagata or in Bordeaux, and talk with the actual producers and companies, what are they talking about? What is the most urgent challenge that is there for them to solve? How do they think about the GI system overall? Is it valuable for them? Do they want to see any changes there, or what's their main challenge for them?
Mhm. One of the things that's been most interesting to me is how different regions are approaching the issue in different ways with different priorities.
Hmm.
I, I think that the appreciation of, in some areas, there is a focus on the premium end of the market, and at the high end of the market, authenticity and provenance can be still incredibly powerful. So I heard over and over that, especially in a global market for export, consumers, especially Western consumers, want storytelling. They want a story that
Hmm.
they trust, that's something that feels real, rooted, distinctive, kind of part of a narrative. And um, particularly the international sales folks in Japan really emphasize this, the power of a story for those international consumers. But at the same time, there's tension. So in places like Napa, for example, I heard concerns about oversupply, the same in Australia, and softening demand, even at the premium levels.
Hmm.
And, as the statistics show that baby boomers drank a lot of wine and they're starting to age out. And the younger generations are not drinking as much wine. So
Hmm.
authenticity alone isn't a guarantee of economic success. It has to somehow shift, make a deal with shifts in consumer behavior. So the market right now is significantly down in Napa, and questions around. Some people said we were all talking about climate change for a while, but now there's sort of another panic mode that is setting in. I'm also thinking of places like McLaren Vale in South Australia, where they are really seeking to create that identity and the storytelling for the global market, to take Australian wine from an international perception of what someone called cheap and cheerful, um, to create,
I love that story.
yeah, to create a kind of value that is thought of as more premium, in nature, as a differentiator for the global market.
Wow. So just so I summarize, we have the shift in climate and weather that is affecting, of course, GIs, but then in some industries they are also facing the challenge of changes in demand or just generational demand changes, I guess.
Yes, and I have had a couple of people who've said to me that there's never been a better time to be a wine drinker in the world, because in a warming environment, there's better wine now that's been produced, than ever before in more regions. So there are a lot of
Wow.
different, where there is challenge, there is also opportunity.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess if there's oversupply, then perhaps some people can get a better price on the product as well.
Yes,
So
cheaper and more cheerful.
cheaper and more cheerful. I think that storytelling sells itself. At least I love that. And I'm very curious, looking at the other side of the coin, if you manage to talk with perhaps trade organizations or government or some sort of even NGOs or foundations that are working around GI and IP, let's say in Asia or Latin America, or in other developing regions, are they trying to learn from the developed countries and already prepare for what's coming?
Yes, there is. I mean, I think that newer systems can learn two things in particular. First, it's really important to build flexibility in from the beginning, to have
Mhm.
GIs or legal frameworks in general, because it's not just GIs, but we're thinking about, there are AVAs, appellations. There's so many different kinds of systems that interact in a legal sense to promote economic development. And as these emerging systems are maturing, it's important to build in the kinds of flexibility that don't tie, that anticipate change and don't simply preserve stability. Many traditional GI systems were meant to kind of keep things static, to preserve the stability. There is no other weather, climate aspect, process like X. But in order to design effective systems, we have to be able to anticipate change. And so that's one lesson that I would give for emerging regions around the world. And then I think the other would be to be thoughtful about when to define the identity. If you define it too early as you're creating a market, you risk locking in something that you might regret later, something that hasn't fully evolved. Um, Virginia is a wine region that is emerging in the United States. And a Virginia wine grower said to me that he felt like it's a little bit too early to start locking in a system of appellations or AVAs because it is just sort of emerging as a terroir, as a culture, as an industry. So if you define it too early, you might lock in something that too early, but if you define it too late, you miss the chance to capture value. So the real challenge, I think, is timing. When's a place ready to be defined? So I would say as emerging regions are thinking about economic community development of markets and industries in this way, those are two pillars to keep in mind.
Wow, I think that was a really, really good free consultation to some of to some of these organizations. And before we round up, I just want to take it down to the very practical level from, the for-profit company's perspective and see how they can use GI as a value-adding tool. So you mentioned there can be, of course, oversupply, and there are perhaps certain industries where GI is overused for storytelling. So, is there an optimal way for a for-profit company to use GI for their benefit?
I think GIs can be incredibly powerful tools for um, industries that are looking to move to scale in a global way. They create a kind of vocabulary, a taxonomy of value that can convey what makes a particular area, a particular industry unique on
Mm.
and to define that globally. So I think for individual companies, they can work with local government and collectively with their their competitors in the system in a collaborative way to help define what makes those systems unique and a way to help convey that to a global market.
Thank you so much. That was, I think, a wonderful summary. of this part of the podcast. Now, I would like to enter into the rapid fire questions section.
Okay.
I'm going to ask you a few IP related statements or questions, and I just want, the word, expression, or sentence that comes top of mind for you for these ideas or questions. And, feel free to elaborate afterwards, but I just want to hear the first glimpse of your mind, if
Sure.
that's okay. Okay, are you ready?
I'm so ready.
Okay. One word for how most IP professionals think about GIs.
I would say niche. Um,
Niche. Hmm.
and can I give two? This like lawyers are terrible at one word
Yeah.
answers. Um, niche, and I think that's a big mistake because it can be a powerful tool for emerging and transitioning economies to be able to provide value in a global market. I think the other word I would use would be static. And people think of it as defining what is unique or special about a certain product connected to region. But that too, I think, is mistaken, and that the GIs of the future need to be able to be both meaningful, but also flexible to adapt over time.
I think that's so fascinating. And also, it's also my mistake to asking for only one word. So sorry for, you know, squeezing you in a small box.
It's
So the
important.
next question
Lawyers,
is,
yeah, lawyers have to
yeah,
be,
I mean,
put in a box somehow. Otherwise, we'll just go on forever and say everything, it
yeah,
depends to everything.
yeah, but I love that both niche and both static. So the next question is, what's your favorite everyday example of GI that perhaps most people mostly use without knowing that it's a GI?
My current favorite, I think, is Prosecco. And
Mm,
that is because it was the subject of contention in the free trade agreement that was recently signed between the EU and Australia. Australia has produced Prosecco for some time, and their position was that it is effectively a varietal. Um, the EU protects Prosecco as a GI, and this, in a very comprehensive free trade agreement, this was the one of the few holdups of the entire agreement, as I understand it. There was a compromise in the agreement that was signed just a few weeks ago in March of 2026. Um, the the end finalized agreement created a situation where Australia is able to use Prosecco on a domestic scale, but for export, they will recognize it as a GI. So it is all about sort of how you define the terms and what they mean, and then sometimes there are compromises to be had as well.
wow, I love that. And it's also so funny that this was the topic that sort of put a small delay on the agreement. I guess all of the other topics were quite easy to agree on, but not the Prosecco.
Yes. Tariffs,
um,
easy. Prosecco, that's the real challenge.
yeah, that's where we spend months on. Yeah. So, if you were to use only one tool, trademarks or GIs?
I would say trademarks because they're more flexible and can adapt more easily to change. Um, they're more comprehensive. But I say that with not just some regret because GIs capture something that trademarks can't, which is a
Yeah.
shared identity, but also because we're realizing more than ever that IP does not fit into neat boxes. When I'm teaching students or talking to clients about IP, we often fall into a trap of this is a trademark, this is a patent, this is a copyright issue. Um, these are trade secrets, and yet issues don't come into neat boxes like that. IP is the legal framework that underpins human creativity and innovation broadly. And so we really need to be effective, we have to think about IP holistically, from a variety of lenses with a variety of forms of protection. So within the same product or within the same creation or invention, you'll have many forms of IP that all interact, from in different ways with a different scope of protection, with different rights and different ways of infringing. Um, and so I hate to kind of parse them out because I think more than ever, as we're seeing development of technology, we're seeing all kinds of things that challenge the notion of those individual boxes for IP. Um, AI is a great example of that. And so I think that if we continue as IP lawyers, professionals, scholars to fit things in individual boxes, we will be at a disadvantage. We do so kind of at our peril as culture shifts and as technology evolves.
I think it's just so important what you said about thinking holistically about IP. And this is not a rapid fire question. It's more just I really want you to elaborate on, how should a company that is perhaps protected by GI craft its IP strategy? Because perhaps there could be some people out there who thinks GI is enough as IP to protect my product. Would you agree with them or would you advise them something else?
No, I think that I would not agree that a GI is itself enough. Of course, I would need to know more about the situation,
Yeah.
but in any particular product or market, you want to be able to maximize the full value of your IP. Um, when people come on Shark Tank and they're pitching an idea and hoping that there will be investors interested in investing in and recognizing that's a TV program and not exactly realistic. But one of the first questions that investors ask is, do you have a patent? What kind of patent is it? Is it a utility patent? Is it a design patent? And that's just the starting point. Every business has a trademark issue. There should be trademarks that protect words, symbols, potentially the shape of products. And and then there are additionally, GIs can capture a kind of collective identity that for something that is connected to a particular place where that connection, that place, product, a nexus is an essential one. So each one, an IP strategy, I have students who or lawyers themselves who will say, I am this kind of IP attorney. I'm that kind of IP attorney. And I think increasingly clients find real value and companies find real value in the kind of lawyers and the kind of advice and counsel that takes into account, that can see big picture, that takes into account a variety of different types of intellectual property and how each of these different tools can be used in different ways, to leverage interests that the others don't capture. So, especially in as AI becomes more and more a part of law practice, I think we're going to find more and more value in the kind of advice that really can be strategic, can see big picture, can think from a business standpoint, in order to advance the interests of a particular company. And I would say that is not just true for companies, but I think it's true for governments, countries, economies, as emerging regions are interested in creating value for industries that are specific to that region, that place. They also need to be thinking holistically to use all the tools in the IP toolbox to capture that value.
Hmm. Thank you so much for that, Megan. So there is one more rapid fire question before we wrap up, and it comes from our last guest. And what he asked was, he would like you to share one thing that makes you optimistic about the future of IP and one thing that makes you pessimistic about the future of IP.
Oh my goodness. One thing that makes me optimistic about the future of IP is,
IP. Yeah.
yes, is that we always feel like we're living in unprecedented times. I'm so tired of hearing the word unprecedented, but law has always tended to move more slowly than technology. Law has always preferred clear definitions, and technology has always moved fast, and culture has always been messy. And so, this is, in a way, we feel like it's new, but this is an age old question about law. And the strain that we're seeing in pressure to update rules in response to, we've been talking about GIs, but the same could be true for AI. Um, Tensions between tradition and adaptation. It hasn't broken the system yet. It has just caused the system to evolve. And so I do not believe, as an IP and tech specialist, that there's been a better time to be in this space, that it is evolving and it will evolve. And I trust that the system will do so as it always has. Um, and I think this is an incredibly exciting time to be engaged in it because the conversations we're having now will help shape that adaptation for the future. And we get to be a
Mm.
part of it. Um, and I absolutely love that. I think that one of the things I worry about is um, an undermining of trust in the rule of law and the system of IP generally. The US Chamber of Commerce comes out with a kind of regular report on an IP, releasing an IP index and talking about the value of IP. And the report came out recently, and it talked about how in, I believe, 8 strong economies that have been around the world that have been really involved in standard setting for IP, it was estimating that IP frameworks have been kind of reduced in strength in in those 8 economies. And I think that IP has a problem with public perception and mistrust. But what people don't understand, I think, and what we can do a better job of is helping people to understand the true importance of strong IP for innovation, for invention, and to promote, incentivize, protect human creativity. Um, and and so I don't know how we fully overcome that kind of PR problem. I feel it's ironic that IP has an IP problem, um, but I find it disappointing. When one example I will give is I remember being in Washington, D.C. during the pandemic, And you would think during the pandemic, when we were relying so much on research and development and pharmaceutical companies to develop um, vaccines to save us all and help us interact with one another again. I remember walking by a bus stop, and it just had the bus stops had big signs on them that said, patents kill. And I remember thinking this kind of backlash against patent rights um, was was something I would not have predicted, but yet, and so I think it's something that we really need to overcome to build trust in the IP system again among the public around the world, and then to really shore up the strength of our IP systems. Because the challenges that we're going to be confronting, all of the grand challenges we face as a society, for me, IP is core to solving every single one of them. And so I'm saddened by, I think, the lack of that lack of trust in the IP system, and hope that we can all work as a community, as a global community, to help rebuild the trust and rebuild the strength of IP systems around the world.
Thank you so much, Megan. I honestly believe that is one of the most important messages of this episode. Um, and with that, I think it's time to end the episode as well. Megan, this has been a genuinely fascinating conversation. Thank you so much once again for accepting the invitation. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and experiences. And for the listeners who are interested in reading your book and following your journey, what's the best place to reach out to you or follow you?
Follow me on LinkedIn. I'll be giving regular updates all the time. And also feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I love engaging in conversation around these topics and exploring different perspectives. So don't hesitate.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Megan. It's been a real pleasure. And to everyone else listening, thank you for tuning in into the newest episode of Talk IP to Me. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a colleague or friend in IP or not in IP, and we'll see you in the next one. Thank you so much.